In May 1940, faced with the German offensive, the strategic plan of France and its allies, established by the French Generalissimo Maurice Gamelin, collapses in just 5 days. The disaster that follows is directly responsible for the death of several 100,000 soldiers and the imprisonment of just under 2 million of them, as well as the fall of France, which, despite its soldiers' heroism, is now at the mercy of its enemies. This catastrophic result generally suggests gross incompetence of Generalissimo Gamelin, who was in charge of operations. But you will quickly understand that Gamelin was many things, but certainly not incompetent, and he was not behind in a war, as one might logically be led to think. But then, what was Gamelin's true value as a military man and senior officer? Was he a capable professional, or just a simple armchair general overwhelmed by his assigned task? Today, I'll examine how he became the leader of the armies. And I guarantee you that without even addressing the course of the Battle of France, 1940, your understanding will have definitely changed. At the end of this documentary, so what was Maurice Gamelin really worth as a military man? Despite his reputation, Gamelin was neither incompetent nor intellectually lacking. In fact, quite the opposite. The young years of the man reveal an absolutely brilliant student, both in his childhood at school and later during his officer training. Concretely, he stands out essentially during his officer training, and this in areas that are as diverse as military theory or the management and administration of men, fields he excels in academically. In fact, his rather intellectual profile encourages him to take the exams to enter the Superior War School, which was an almost unavoidable step at the time, in order to occupy a place in a general's staff. This training, as much as his qualities, allows him to climb the ranks within the army without a hitch, until his fate changes in 1906, thanks to an extraordinary encounter. It was that year that a 30-year-old Gamelin met the famous General Joseph Joffre, whom he became the aide-de-camp to, which is essentially a kind of military servant. There, the officer impressed Joffre, who noted his clear grasp of military matters. In fact, a top-notch officer destined for brilliant success everywhere. This mutual and professional respect, which is built over the months, means that Joffre tries to keep Gamelin with him as much as possible. Unsurprisingly, Gamelin is part of the establishment when his superior, Joffre, is appointed head of the French armies in 1911. But once we've seen that, what is Gamelin really worth on the field? He also excels during the required command periods essential to his officer career. Thus, he restores order wherever he can, within the units entrusted to him. He effectively leads his troops during field maneuvers and training. Once again, his direct superiors are impressed and praise his abilities. Consequently, from his exemplary career, nothing opposes his appointment to the General Staff of the Armies, alongside General Joffre in November 1913. Maurice Gamelin is a brilliant intellectual officer who has proven himself and belongs in the General Staff. But it is only from the following year that Gamelin's real military value will be put to the test. World War I began in 1914. This period is particularly interesting, as it allows us to analyze how Maurice Gamelin, known to be intellectual and competent in peacetime, holds up when confronted with the practice and realities of war. This formative period for him also reveals a great deal of his strengths and weaknesses. The initial weeks of the war proved disastrous for the French army, with failed offensives resulting in heavy casualties, while the German army progresses rapidly, pushing the entire country to the brink of the abyss. Yes, that's well seen. It looks a lot like May 1940, and this moment is therefore essential to understand the character. In fact, Gamelin responds well to the situation without panicking. On the contrary, he contributes to implementing a solution through his organizational and relational abilities. As a liaison officer between the general staff and the field, he excels in this role. Showing pedagogy, tact, and diplomacy, his intervention allows the proper execution of the headquarters orders on the field. He actively contributes to strategy, staying current with developments and aiding in plan implementation, leading to the famous Miracle of the Marne, putting an end to the German advance. Gamelin's actions do not match the cautious and timid officer image he was labeled with after the May debacle, 1940, but it is indeed the fire of this war that shapes the man as much as the future Generalissimo of 1940. The long, violent conflict enables him to hold various positions within the general staff and on the field, advancing his rank in the French army. These different assignments confirm the many qualities mentioned previously, but will also reveal first weaknesses. Thus, during this period, he illustrates the flaw of his quality, which will also pose serious problems in May 1940, while being convincing, unifying, and diplomatic, which works wonderfully with most of his interlocutors. His aversion to conflict and desire not to offend make it difficult for him to get reluctant men to obey him. He thus finds himself occasionally having to call on a more dry and sharp Joffre to resolve certain situations. Keep this character trait in mind to understand the character better, as we'll encounter him in other situations, with this aspect being crucial in the May 1940 disaster. During this time, Gamelin becomes politicized. It was the eviction of his superior, General Joffre, that prompted him to get closer to the political world. For a very simple reason, the disgrace of his boss makes him realize the importance of cultivating good relationships with the political world, on which the army in practice depends. Generally, during this conflict, Gamelin makes an excellent right-hand man within the general staff, but is much less convincing when he has more scope. To give you an example, at one point he had the opportunity to single-handedly set up offensives that he orders, but does not really lead on the ground, and the result for once is simply bad. The offensives fail completely, and the front he commands is severely damaged, making offensives impossible for many months. But beyond this so-called armchair journey, far from the daily reality of war. Did Gamelin command on the field? Gamelin not only commanded on the field multiple times, but also consistently distinguished himself there. Very present and appreciated by the men under his orders, whom he treats indeed with a certain distance, but above all, with a lot of kindness. He demonstrates excellent organizational skills that earn him several successes, both defensive and offensive. A telling example occurred in March 1918 during the war's final months. Gamelin is then at the head of the 9th Infantry Division, as the last great and powerful German offensive begins. Under pressure, the Allied front falters at several points, particularly in the Noyon sector, where the British line breaks. The French army responds to this danger by urgently sending 4 divisions to fill the gaping hole into which several German divisions are pouring. Among these divisions is Gamelin's division, which arrives first on the scene and is given a particularly perilous mission. At all costs, the 6 German divisions pouring into the breach must be slowed down in order to allow the other 3 French divisions to position themselves and prepare their position. And one point that is important to keep in mind is that this breakthrough means that there are no longer any trenches or fortifications that the French can rely on. So it's a battle on open ground, all against an enemy who is significantly more numerous. This is how no less than 9 German divisions are in the sector, 6 of which are directly engaged in the battle. In Phase 2, General Gamelin's 9th Infantry Division theoretically has forces that only allow it to hold a front of a maximum of 6 km. However, due to the situation, the division must hold a front varying from 10 to 18 kilometers, depending on the phases of the battle. So, what solution did Gamelin find to this problem? Well, for once, he was frankly clever, since he essentially chose to play on the movement that the absence of fortification offered him, while effectively relying on the terrain. Following this logic, He ensures his men fight during the day but move at night to reduce their vulnerability to enemy fire. Thus, after 3 exhausting days of combat, the men of the 9th Infantry Division are finally supported by their reinforcements. Now well positioned and prepared, the Germans are received as they should be. Their offensive is halted and the way to Paris is now once again denied to them. The end of the First World War thus clearly outlines the professional and human profile of Gamelin. He is a dependable officer whom the army can trust without hesitation. He excels in the field and grasps the significance of mobile warfare in battle. However, at the same time, while he excels in a context where he is supervised by one or more superiors, whether in a staff or on the field, he struggles when he no longer has this support and framework. The post-war years only confirm everything we've seen so far. Gamelin continues a nearly exemplary career and distinguishes himself again in the Levant, allowing him to be promoted to Corps General in November 1927. But then how did we go from Gamelin, brilliant officer and Corps General, to Gamelin Generalissimo in May 1940? Well, this page of France's history begins when his phone rings. January 1st, 1930. January 1st, 1930. General Gamelin hears the famous Minister of Defense André Maginot on the other end of the line. He offers him a position as deputy chief within the Army's General Staff, which is commanded by the no less famous Maxime Weygand, whose profile we could also analyze soon if you're interested, since he takes over command of the French armies at the end of May 1940, following Gamelin. In fact, Weygand and Gamelin have very different personalities. General Corap, who has worked with both men, perfectly summarizes the character gap that separates them. Gamelin adapts to events when writing, while Weygand seeks to direct them. And this is entirely accurate during their years of collaboration, as Weygand is consistently steadfast. Even if it means falling out with some of the political leaders, Gamelin shows tact and diplomacy, making him much more flexible and accommodating, and therefore more appreciated by these same political personalities. Gamelin actively aligns with the center-left radical party led by Édouard Daladier, whom he supports, even if it means opposing his own colleagues, especially Weygand. However, Germany had started rearming in the early 1930s, even before Hitler's rise to power. On the subject, Weygand and Gamelin will disagree on what France's response should be in this regard. Weygand is above all convinced of the necessity to firmly impose the conditions of the Treaty of Versailles of 1919 on Germany. This therefore implies financing the army to make it capable of carrying out large-scale offensive operations, which it can no longer effectively do. However, Gamelin also recognizes the threat German rearmament poses to France. But he ultimately sides with his political allies' positions, without truly attempting to assert his own views and analysis of the situation. Here we find a characteristic trait of the general. His tactfulness and diplomacy are accompanied by an ability to remain unobtrusive to avoid causing offense, as well as avoiding conflict here with the radicals whom he wishes to make allies. Thus, between 1930 and 1935, he supports several budget cuts, reduction in staff and reduction in military service time in a context where France is experiencing a serious economic crisis. During this period, he begins to advocate for a more empathetic and adaptable stance regarding Germany, while remaining convinced that France must prepare for a possible conflict due to the ongoing rearmament across the Rhine. It's a bit of an acrobatic position, but it sums up Gamelin well. Intellectually perfectly capable, he understands the situation, but he fades away when he feels that his opinion will not pass. Those who, unlike Weygand, express their disagreement without hesitation, consequently fall out with a significant part of the political world, rendering themselves unheard. The contrast in Gamelin and Weygand's character and posture leads to a permanent falling out, despite maintaining professional respect for each other. As an anecdote, this happened in December 1933 when Hitler had come to power in Germany. Daladier, exploring army budget cuts, retorts to a grumbling Weygand. The Hitler question does not interest the council. In hindsight, it's easy to see it as guilty blindness given what followed. But it remains important to understand that at the time, the situation was not as clear as it would be, for example, a few years later, during the Munich agreements. But in the heart of winter, in January 1935, a law concerning the French army will change the fate of the country. 5 years later, in January 1935, General Weygand reaches the age of 68 and must retire. This rule, quite healthy and logical, has the consequence of freeing up the position of head of the armies, for which 4 experienced generals are considered. These are Generals Gaston Belote, André Pretola, Alphonse Georges, and of course Maurice Gamelin. General Weygand, to whom the government asks more for form than anything else. He supports appointing Alphonse Georges, whose character he respects. On the contrary, he expresses a particularly unfavorable opinion of Gamelin, whose intellectual and analytical qualities he nevertheless appreciates, but considers that he does not have the character of a leader, at least as he understands it. In reality, Weygand's opinion carries little weight, as he is at odds with a large part of the political world. On his side, Gamelin intelligently relies on his political supporters, allowing him to climb the ultimate step of his career. The appointment to the head of the army in 1935, a decision, while being eminently political, is no less based on Gamelin's remarkable career so far. He climbed the ranks to the highest positions in the French army, mainly due to his skills, while his political support made the difference when it came to taking the final step. How could this officer, despite his brilliant profile and peer recognition, have led the French army to disaster? Gamelin can't do what he wants when he takes over the armies. Upon taking office, he conducts relevant analyses about the French army's situation, revealing its severe deficiencies, and has fallen behind in relation to Germany. But he has to deal with a political context that is unstable, making effective planning difficult, as well as imposing a number of decisions on him. Like his predecessor, he inherits the Maginot Line, which he also finds too rigid but must integrate into his plans. Similarly, he has to deal with a French arms industry that is simply completely out of touch. Due to the army's low budgets in prior years, industrialists were compelled to considerably scale back their operations. Only politicians can rectify the situation by investing the necessary resources. But how does this translate into Gamelin's strategic thinking? Well, this context, as much as his belief that infantry remains the queen of battles, encourages him to opt for a posture that is defensive, relying on a continuous front line. The idea here is to rely on an infantry that is massively deployed, occupying solid positions, which thus consume few men and resources. But modern methods certainly have their place there. Several infantry divisions are motorized in order to enable them to stabilize this front line by intervening quickly in a troubled area. From 1938 onwards, this doctrine is reinforced by armored divisions, composed of powerful tanks, whose objective is not to lead an attack, but to fill the gaps opening in the front. So it is a modernized positional war that the general advocates, all embodied by a resolutely defensive posture, imposed by the French context. This posture is not absurd, as France experienced a rapid decline in its military capabilities during the 1930s, while Germany is initiating the opposite approach and is getting ahead in its rearmament, meaning that France, its army, and its industry simply need several years before they have the means to opt for a more offensive posture again. His strategic vision is defensible considering his context. But if Gamelin is competent with sound strategic reasoning, how could he have led his army to disaster? Well, in reality, the Gamelin fortress does have a flaw: his character. Generally, as we have seen, while he produces analyses that are quite relevant, as well as coherent and credible plans in light of the context, he tends to simply adapt to or even endure circumstances instead of actively working to change things in a direction he believes in. but necessarily requiring to mobilize people around a project and also to ruffle a few feathers. Whether during peace or war, a leader must be a driving force, showing the way and demonstrating tenacity to achieve desired results. Gamelin, despite his many qualities, simply does not excel in this area. His stance towards armored vehicles is particularly telling, as it is timid. Initially, Gamelin demonstrates that he fully understands that armored vehicles have an important role to play, by stating, for example, as early as the spring of 1936, to Minister Edouard Daladier, "We need armored units." Hitler now has 3 panzer divisions. To win, we need something better than the panzers. But this stance, while relevant, commits to nothing if it is not followed by a concrete plan to implement it. In fact, he hasn't initiated anything significant on the subject, including trials, maneuvers, or even seeking government credit. In the end, he doesn't take a stance, providing no guidance on the topic's visions, in a way allowing things to unfold naturally without much involvement. This stance on the French QRAC divisions has a direct consequence. Policymakers do not grasp the importance of the subject, since Gamelin is content to point out its interest without proposing a use. As a result, they only take shape on the ground very late, several months after the declaration of war in 1939. By then, it's too late to experiment and adjust, leading to several disasters. In May 1940, I'm specifically referring to the crushing defeat of the 1st QRAC Division at Flavian and the disaster that befell the 2nd QRAC Division, which was never able to be fully deployed due to multiple organizational failures. The late deployment of these divisions is not due to a lack of equipment, because it was entirely possible as early as 1937 to set up at least one armored division. But it is indeed the absence of a somewhat solid will, both on the part of Gamelin and the political decision makers. Strategically, Gamelin preferred adapting to circumstances instead of leading potential change. The context encourages him to adopt a defensive posture, so the armored weapon becomes a defensive and auxiliary weapon aimed at plugging the gaps in the front. But then, did General Maurice Gamelin really have a war delay? Well, yes and no. First of all, it is ultimately quite logical that the experience gained during the First World War is not stupidly thrown in the trash. This experience is exploited, and indeed, many ways of seeing things are inherited from the period. But they are not absurd, since they are not fixed, but rather adapted to material changes, certainly imperfectly. Gamelin's most evident legacy is anticipating the conflict from a methodical rather than dynamic perspective, in contrast to the German posture, which favors a war of movement, despite lacking the strength for a positional war. Gamelin envisions the impending war as a game of chess, gigantic, where each division, like the pieces on a chessboard, has specific characteristics, exploitable in a well-defined context. This vision is far from absurd, especially in the French context, but it has 2 major weaknesses that will prove fatal. It is, on one hand, rigid, and on the other hand, leaves little room for initiative or the unexpected. While it anticipates methodical movements spread over several days and not a few hours, as will actually be the case on the German side in May 10/140. It's crucial to note that Gamelin's approach to war is outdated, as it's a mere copy-paste of the doctrines from 1914 to 1918. On the contrary, the concept of opposition warfare is modernized and updated, absolutely taking into account technological advances, certainly, with several misses regarding the potential of certain new weapons. The army is organized for this modernized positional warfare, with all its consequences, for the anticipation of the logistics required for operations, communication between units and the different levels of the army, the use of different weapons, aviation, etc. And yes, in this context, why mobilize resources that would allow for the development of logistics capable of quickly following on any terrain? Similarly, communication by telephone and motorcycle courier between units does the job perfectly and costs less than a generalization of the use of radio. Aviation, like armored vehicles, becomes an auxiliary weapon, primarily needing to be able to protect French territory from bombings rather than supporting ground units. thus encouraging the development of fighters rather than bombers. While in this logic, tanks do not lead offensives, but must, on the other hand, be able to firmly hold a position. Therefore, armored vehicles must be solid and powerful, making them heavy, slow, and logistically demanding, and so on. This provides insight into Gamelin's character and his actual role in the disaster of June 1940. In fact, I had asked you ahead of this documentary, which term best defines Maurice Gamelin for you? And the majority of you had responded incompetent. And very honestly, a year ago I thought the same thing. However, you have likely evolved on this subject. Personally, I think Gamelin was primarily a tactician who would have been a valuable asset for the French army at the head of one of the armies on the ground, rather than the position of commander-in-chief that was entrusted to him. And why? Well, as we have seen, he was objectively a brilliant officer and quite capable. He has had his greatest successes when it came to applying or implementing a previously defined strategy by optimizing the use of the means at his disposal, while being perfectly capable of adapting to various contexts while keeping his cool. In short, when it came to tactics, but despite his many qualities, he didn't really have the character of a supreme leader. Lacking sharpness, he tended to adapt to circumstances rather than trying to master them. This is ideal for a tactician and a field officer who must excel in the field. But it's potentially catastrophic for a military leader whose job consists, among other things, of defining and maintaining a clear course regardless of the current weather. In fact, this tendency to want to adapt to events, not to say sometimes, simply to endure them rather than to lead them, means that he simply doesn't know how to react when the unexpected happens. His meticulously prepared plan collapses when the Germans break through. As seen, he is rapidly morally impacted, leaving him utterly overwhelmed by the circumstances and incapable of regaining control of his ship amidst a storm. General George, the second in command, was not chosen as Generalissimo in 1935, who, after a brief period of dejection, rises to the challenge and regains control as best he can while the French army is adrift. On May 10, 1940, the German army launched its offensive. The commander-in-chief Maurice Gamelin is a brilliant officer who has earned his place at the head of the French armed forces. Yet he and his army are mere hours away from plummeting into the abyss, as will be shown in the upcoming video series. Thank you for watching this documentary to the end. I hope it allowed you to better understand the Battle of France in 1940. These topics are fascinating yet demanding to prepare, so I aim to be both clear and interesting. And it's through your blue thumbs and your comments that I systematically say, even if I have to repeat myself there too, that I will know that my mission is accomplished. On that note, do you know how? Gamelin, as much as the French army tried to respond to the German attack of May 1940? No? The next video is made for you.